Hey guys, another video on abortion coming up. So, in the past, I've been arguing that the Bible does not support and actually contradicts the notion that abortion is murder. And if you want to debate what the Bible has to say about it, check out the previous videos. For this video, we're going to try and blaze some new ground. A common response that I've been getting is to say that the early church is very consistently opposed to abortion, and that many of these influential Christian figures have argued consistently that a fetus has a soul at conception, and that therefore abortion is murder. So I think that the idea, well, let's actually just look at their argument. It might look something like this.
If you intentionally kill something with a soul, you commit murder. A fetus has a soul at conception. Intentionally killing a fetus is therefore murder. So
the first thing I'd like to point out is that the early church is not actually unanimous about when a fetus has a soul. A lot of Christians, historically and currently, have argued that a fetus has a soul at conception. But this is not an idea found directly in the Bible, nor is it an idea a Christian has to be committed to. I'll explain why in a moment, but first I want to turn my attention to two prime candidates to what might actually be the most influential Christian thinkers of all time. These are the guys so prominent they actually show up in my philosophy, or pretty much every Philosophy 101 textbook. They're named St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas.
St. Augustine is often referred to as the Christian version of the philosopher Plato. He is a church father and one of the 35 people who is labeled as a doctor of the church. This is the guy who gets credit for discovering the doctrine of original sin. In Christian circles, he's pretty much a big deal. So it's not some kind of fringe character that's holding on to an obscure and unusual view.
So the dominant belief of Plato, and pretty much every other philosopher at this time, is that a human being is going to get a soul when it takes what's called the form of a human. So for all intents and purposes, this means that you get a soul when you start to look like a human. A lump of cells is not likely to have a soul. A thing that looks like a human, walks like a human, has feelings like a human, that might have a soul just like a human, so it should be treated of value. Augustine actually tells us in one of his books called On Exodus. My tape has fallen off. Oh well. Oh, I see. On Exodus, he says, as long as we're talking about 40 days before conception, okay, that's important time. Augustine and Aquinas both believe that ensoulment happens at around day 40. We'll explain why in a second. But Augustine says that abortion should not be referred to as homicide because, quote, as homicide, for there cannot be a living soul in a body that lacks sensation due to its not being fully formed. So most Catholics and people of the early church believed in something called natural law. And what that means is that you can understand the Creator, you can understand God by understanding nature. After all, He's nature's creator, right? So we should study nature. And the study of nature is called science. So essentially, you need science to understand God. Or at least that's one way of understanding God. Science informs the answers of the viewpoints of the church fathers. Augustine sets a precedent for telling us that the body that lacks sensation also very likely lacks a soul. So using the science of his day, he figured that it would take about 40 days after conception for a fetus to have sensation. Nowadays, we know...
We know that.
Or at least she knows.
We know that at 5 weeks that the fetal brain begins to form. So it's about a month. And it doesn't fully finish developing until week 12. So takes about 3 months for the brain and the nervous system to be fully formed.
Right. No nervous system, no sensation.
That's correct.
That's going to be important. So that isn't to say that we are sure when a fetus gains a soul, but it is to say that science is important here. That Augustine tells us that it's much more likely that a human has a soul once it has sensation, and that's obviously going to be some point a good while after conception.
Scientific misinformation has led many astray to this point. In the 17th century, scientists began to look through microscopes and thought they observed fully formed yet extremely tiny humans in the middle of fertilized eggs. This idea that a human embryo was always a tiny yet fully formed human being during pregnancy is called Homunculus. This scientific finding would cast a doubt on Augustine's conclusion. And if you buy into the idea that a fetus likely gets its soul when it starts to look human, then you buy into the idea that a fetus has a soul during conception. The scientific misinformation then led many people to conclude that a fetus has a soul from the very beginning. Natural law may be able to tell us about the nature's creator and his intentions, but only if we have a complete understanding of nature.
Yeah, or at least an accurate understanding of nature. The homunculus was a total bogus idea. It was misinformation. Those scientists made an actual error. So ironically, Augustine was actually closer to accurate. They thought that a fetus always had sensation, that it was always a very tiny human and just grew in size. But we know that's not actually how things go down. Another figure I want to look at very briefly is St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas also thought that a fetus did not achieve a soul until around the 40-day mark into pregnancy. But he has an actually more elaborate view on the soul. He thinks about it a bit more than I think your average Christian does.
St. Thomas Aquinas was actually a massively influential character in philosophy. Like Augustine, he also shows up in about every Philosophy 101 textbook. Also, like Augustine, he is one of the 35 people who are called doctors of the church.
Yep. Augustine likely thought about souls a whole lot more than the rest of us. He actually argued very similar to Aristotle that there's 3 parts of the soul. I won't try and bore you too much with these details, but they're the vegetative, appetitive, and contemplative part of the soul. The vegetative part is the part which means you're alive. It's the one that allows you to seek nutrients, to grow, things of that nature. So plants can even do that kind of thing. And then you also have the appetitive part, which is the part that animals are famous for doing, having desires, having motivations. And last but not least is the contemplative part of the soul. This is what allows you to reason, or perhaps even contemplate morality. So when Thomas Aquinas argues that we obtain a soul at 40 days as a fetus, he was not arguing that we obtain all parts of the soul. He was arguing we obtain the vegetative part, which is the part that makes us valuable, it makes us alive. But surely we become more valuable once we achieve or become a fully adult human. For Aquinas, everything is valuable insofar as it is godlike. So the more like God you are, the more valuable you are. Humans are the most valuable of all creatures because we, as the Bible tells us, are literally created in the image of God. The image of God means the rational part of the soul. This is what allows us to reason, what makes us moral agents. We are like God in a way that plants and animals simply are not. Now, in the beginning, the Bible tells us that everything was created good. Well, Aquinas' explanation for this is that plants were good because they have the vegetative part of the soul. Animals are also good because they have both the vegetative and appetitive part of the soul, but humans are best of all because we have all 3 parts of the soul. So what do you think Aquinas would find more valuable, a fetus or the mother?
It sounds like Aquinas would say the mother would be more valuable since she has all 3 parts of the soul.
Exactly. So what do you think, and this might be a little tricky question, what do you think Aquinas and Augustine think about abortion? Remember, they're arguing that a fetus does not have a soul until day 40. So that mean they're okay with abortion?
I feel like they would say that early abortion would be okay, but not later after it acquires the soul after 40 days? Possibly.
Maybe, but they're actually both opposed to it.
Right.
Right. So, do with that what you will. Take it away.
So the reason some people say abortion is murder is often based on the view that the fetus gets a soul at conception, and therefore is equally valid to fully formed humans. This view seems to be based on faulty science and also seems to be lacking a biblical perspective. As shown in previous videos, the biblical position seems to imply that the fetus is less valuable than the mother.
The scientific stuff, I just want to talk about that briefly for one more moment before we wrap up. The homunculus was a bogus idea that even when it got overturned, people still kind of held on to the conclusions they originally had. So it feels like people's views didn't change with science. The idea ensoulment happens at conception is tricky for a number of reasons, besides being based upon a lot of people trying to support that with bogus science. Think about, what do you call those twins that share one conception event and turns into 2 different?
The identical twins. Okay,
so that is an example that's kind of tricky for a person that believes ensoulment happens at conception. Because there's only one conception event and yet 2 beings, so supposedly 2 souls, right?
Or what, is it 1 soul split into 2?
Yeah, it's weird, right? If that's their position, it becomes a contrived, confusing example. Chimeras seem to be even more difficult to explain. That's 2 conception events, and then they turn into 1 person. Right, so again, these issues are only really complex when it comes to having a soul if you think ensoulment happens at conception, which I'm not sure why people actually really believe that's the case. We looked last time at some verses where people try and argue ensoulment happens in conceptions, but I think they're all quite a stretch. Alright, so in conclusion, while it doesn't seem that Moses, Aquinas, or Augustine would feel right saying that abortion is murder, those individuals might actually still be opposed to abortion in the vast majority of cases. Either way, I hope this kind of videos get you thinking about abortion. Hopefully I've said something that you hadn't heard before, or if you had heard it, maybe said it to you in a different way. Well, until next time.
Test everything, hold on to the good. He's a slave driver, I tell you.